Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, I want to get back to some of the roots of my channel and talk more about heroes. And I'm going to talk about Peter Parker, Spider-Man, the only actual Spider-Man, as a hero. But I realized when thinking about this that in order to do that, first I have to talk about Spider-Man as an American myth. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that there are 2 links in the description and on the pinned comment. They are for my graphic novel campaigns. One is for my superhero graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes. You can order both of those at that campaign. The second is for my fantasy graphic novel campaign, Crom the Destroyer, a return to form for low fantasy. We just closed out the 60-day campaign for that book, and we hit about, I think it was 17,500. I'm still hoping to push that up past 20,000 while it's in demand, because we did that with the Valiant Heroes. And that would put it into the bracket of, yes, I can justify a second volume of this. But all in all, my graphic novels are about true heroes in various forms, and it is given to you through old-style storytelling and pure entertainment. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, because you're looking at some of the beautiful art from Crom the Destroyer in the background, then click on those links in the description or in the pinned comment and go on over and get yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. But back to my topic. So, in order to talk about Spider-Man as an American myth, first I think I have to talk a little bit about American myth itself and one of the key drivers of that. And by the way, I want to thank Connor Tomlinson from over at the Lotus Eaters. The last time we talked about American comics as part of what he calls the American monomyth, which got me into looking into this connection more earnestly between myth and comics. But here's the real thing about Spider-Man. He's centered in New York, and New York plays a pivotal role in most of Marvel Comics, especially the Marvel Comics between the beginning of Marvel and at the very least up until about 2000. And there's something mythological about the city of New York itself that definitely plays straight into the origins and really the character of Spider-Man. And forgive me for putting on my historian's hat for a few minutes here, but you have to look at New York itself as a picture of the American city. It is considered the archetype of the American city. And here's the thing about that American city that shaped not only Spider-Man, but so many comic characters, especially from Marvel. It itself is a part of a cyclical movement within the history of America itself. And that cyclical part of the history of America is the fact that over and over again, America starts to draw in immigrants from places it usually doesn't. There becomes a critical mass of those immigrants wherein there's almost too many, if not too many. Then America closes their doors in order to assimilate all of these people. And that assimilation usually takes place and is prompted by what happens within the large cities. Because the point is that if you get a lot of people who are not used to the rules of America coming into America and they all coalesce around cities because that's where they can make money, then you start to have an almost breakdown of the societal rules. And what do you get? You get a lot of crime. So you can see how this plays into Spider-Man as a resident of New York City, as a crime fighter, especially in his origin. But we'll get to that in a minute. Now, the interesting thing to do is to look at the last 3 of these cycles, which are within the creation of comic books themselves. The first one, and I'm doing this just off the top of my head from the last time I looked at these graphs, there was a mass wave of immigration from places like Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Jewish people from all over the world. They coalesced, really, within New York City, a lot of them. And then you saw the closing of these doors within the early 1900s and really into the 1920s and some of the 1930s. You had destabilization, and then you had a restabilization with essentially the Second World War, where everybody had to fight together for America, and therefore everybody just looked at each other after that as we're all Americans. But you get to see when you read interviews with people like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko or other early artists that brought about the origins of many of these comic book characters, you get to see just exactly how much all of this affected them. Jack Kirby talks about how living in New York, there were just certain streets that you did not cross because you weren't Irish or Italian or things like that. And the thing is, this cycle of immigrants coming in and then having to close their doors because there was basically a lot of crime, a lot of civil unrest because they had to assimilate these people. This happened again within the 60s and the 70s. America threw open its doors to people from places it never typically took in before, which were mostly Spanish speaking places. This led to a destability within the 60s and 70s, especially within larger cities once again. The doors had to be closed, and these people were assimilated, although I don't think they were assimilated as well as the first batch that we talked about, which was during World War II. This was much more of a slow assimilation, although it did take place. I do have some personal experience with this because, yeah, my parents, they immigrated to the United States during this period, although they weren't part of that wave of immigration. They were a little bit before that, within, I think it was the late 50s. They became legalized aliens. And although they didn't move to New York, they moved to a large East Coast city, one of the largest, just a couple of hours away from New York. That's where I was born and reared. They moved into a place which was a suburb of the major city, which was originally a very well-to-do suburb, but at that time was becoming more and more blue collar. But by the time I was growing up, it became a hellhole. My family got mixed up in some things that had to do with crime, not directly, just affected by it in a very negative way. And my parents decided, yeah, instead of being near a place where we can get a lot of money and have no security, we're going to move to the country. There's not a lot of money there, but we have security. So yeah, I do have some personal experience with this. This is something that's very much driven into the mindset of my family. And we very much saw New York as a part of that. Everything is going to hell. I can remember even in the 1990s, we were driving down Route 9 on our way to North Carolina to visit family, and you got to go a little bit through the Bronx and I think some of Manhattan before you cross the Hudson. And the question went around the car, do you want to actually go into New York? Because we never actually been into New York. And the answer took about 2 seconds for everybody to reply, hell no. And that was just a leftover mindset from really the 70s. And I'm relating all of that because I would say that people like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Stan Lee, these other people who created especially Marvel Comics and that center of New York, they remember that first version of what I was talking about where, everybody was situated into their own little ethnic pods within the city, which led to spikes in crime to say the least. And they were seeing it again playing out within the 60s and the 70s. And that's part and parcel of the reason why you have the structure of American comics that come predominantly from Marvel, again, with the center of New York as a crime-ridden place where you have to have these crime fighters in order to solve the problem. And since we're going to bring this American myth idea forward to today with Spider-Man, we have to look at the fact that we are in the middle of that exact cycle right now. We've hit pretty much the boiling point of where America can get with bringing in immigrants from places it typically doesn't take them. We see giant spikes of crime within cities all over the place, and this contributes very much to the myth that the quote-unquote progressive people are trying to subvert about America. And this is why I'm not entirely hopeful about the fact that this cycle is going to close once more, because identity politics is saying everyone should stay in their little cloistered part of the city and defend it vehemently and never become part of the melting pot. That plus the fact that cities themselves are being abandoned by the non-immigrant populations of America because we don't really need them anymore. You can work remotely, who cares? But anyways, this all plays into the idea of the American myth of the city, which is part and parcel of Marvel Comics, which uses America as the largest city, that myth city, for its entire storyline, which then plays into the biggest hero of that city, which is Peter Parker, Spider-Man. And also there is that connection, as I mentioned just a moment ago, with the fact that I would say these early creators for Marvel, they lived through a wave of this within New York City, and we're seeing this wave again within the 60s and 70s of this massive rise in crime, which contributes to the reason why these superheroes exist and their origins itself. So let's look for a moment at the origin of Spider-Man. Yes, I know everybody here probably really knows the origin of Spider-Man, but we're going to go over some finer points, so we might as well do this. And I'm just doing it from memory, of course, so correct me in the comments if I get anything slightly wrong. Peter Parker is a very smart high school student. He doesn't have a mother and father. They're not in the picture. He's raised by his aunt and uncle, Aunt May, and Uncle Ben. He is bitten by a radioactive spider, which gives him the proportional strength, speed, and agility of a spider. And what does he do with this newfound power? He decides to make himself rich. He enters himself into what is basically a mixed fighting tournament, really a wrestling tournament. He wins a lot of money, and as he's collecting his money, the place gets robbed. He can very easily stop this robbery with his newfound powers, but he just chooses to leave it be. It's not his problem. The thief gets away, and then later on, that same thief kills his Uncle Ben. Peter Parker then realizes with great power comes great responsibility, which makes him become Spider-Man, and after that point, he becomes a crime fighter. Now, you have these quote-unquote progressive people these days who try to make the argument that Spider-Man was always a progressive hero. And this is part of their new mythology for America. But all you got to do is a little more than scratch the surface to understand that this is definitely not the case. And so I'm going to claw deeply at the surface. And the real origin point of answering the question of whether or not he's a hero who fights for justice or a social justice hero is how A, the creators, B, the audience, C, this specific story, and D, storytelling itself, defines human nature in that moment of him becoming a hero. Western storytelling itself, as I'm always going on about, is a view of story as a reflection of reality and a well-argued rhetorical argument, which is to say a logical and rational rhetorical argument. This goes back for thousands of years in Western civilization for storytelling, so we're going to take that as our format of analyzing the entire thing, logic and reason. So let's, for a moment, logically and rationally break down the difference between a progressive idea of human nature as opposed to the traditional Western civilization view of human nature. The progressive idea, quote unquote progressive, comes from a, yes, socialist and communist mindset, an ideological mindset based upon those strains of thinking, which says that human beings are essentially by their nature, even though they deny really any human nature. Again, it's not rational, but we can apply reason to understand it, just like a doctor can diagnose a mental illness. So yes, understanding that they deny any real connection or human nature itself, they also see human nature as being essentially good at the same time. And if human nature is essentially good, that means that everything that comes out from within you is good as well. Therefore, where does something like crime come from? Well, it comes from outside social forces. And therefore, it is those outside social forces A, that motivate things, and B, that have to be dealt with. Whereas within the traditional way, the Western civilization way of looking at human nature, and it is very heavily influenced, of course, by Christianity, it's the idea that, yeah, our human nature is broken from the get-go. Again, this plays into the Christian idea of original sin, but it's that, yes, since our human nature is broken, when bad things happen, it's because they come out from the inside of human beings. Those human beings are embracing the worst part of that brokenness, which then leads to a habitual way of living, which again is an extension of their own free choice, freely choosing to embrace what is the worst part of their nature, which then becomes things like crime. And so again, it is an individual way of looking at the origin of problems. And I'll have to add, this also leads into the thing I'm always talking about, the difference between a guilt culture and a shame culture, and how progressivism is a shame culture predominantly, and Western civilization is, for the last 2,000 years, predominantly a guilt culture. The difference being, of course, tied into that exact view of human nature, the progressive view of human nature is since you're essentially good, nothing bad comes from inside of you. Therefore, the controlling forces come from outside, and people need to be shamed into what they see as good behavior, which is don't associate with these other parts of society. The entire thing is a shame mechanism. Whereas traditional ways of looking at human nature and Western civilization, you're saying either A, you have this law written on your heart, and so you already internalize the rules, or at the very least, if you don't look at it that way, you take those rules and internalize them onto your individual self. And so when you do something bad, you point the finger at yourself. You don't need a shame mechanism outside of you to point a finger at you. You point the finger at yourself and say, I have to change. There's a problem with me. This is the origin of why things are going wrong. Now, imposing all of those rational distinctions upon the origin of Peter Parker Spider-Man, and you'll see that he is indeed a traditional hero. First off, you have the fact of this crime itself, and the fact that this crime happens because Peter Parker said to himself, I'm not going to stop that criminal, why should I? And then it goes and bites him in the backside because his uncle gets killed by that same criminal. This is a part of, I would say, the American myth mindset that, yeah, you can't just let injustice go. If you do, it's going to come back to haunt you. This is exactly where the story of Spider-Man comes from, because he lets it go and it does come back to haunt him. And again, I would say this is something that I can attest to in my own life. This is the reason why my family picked up and moved, because, yeah, we ignored the crime going on about us and it came up and bit us in the backside. So, yeah, this is part and parcel of the American city mythos. But this is not a quote-unquote progressive way of looking at things. Why? Because the progressive way of looking at it is crime is a product of the system. Therefore, you as an individual really can't do anything about it. It is the system that needs to change, not you. You're good as you are. And it's foolish to think that you as an individual can have an impact that is going to change an entire system. What you need to do is join your political power with that of other people and make a competing system which will then fight with the system itself in order for it to change. That's the only way things are going to be made better. You can't do it as an individual. That's why to them it's not about justice, it's about social justice. So as I said, that's number one. The very fact that Peter Parker could have stopped this from happening had he acted as an individual and have done his, what basically would have been seen as, at that time, his civic duty, not to allow crime to run rampant, especially with his easy ability to stop it. So that points to a world of justice, not social justice. And secondly, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, because, again, just working off memory, but he did eventually get to track down that criminal and bring him to justice, or at the very least, if I'm misremembering it, he did track down other criminals and bring them to justice as, in a way, a surrogate for paying back that injustice that he should have stopped to begin with. But again, this is contrary to a quote-unquote progressive way of looking at things. Because in the 60s and the 70s, and I would say even into the early 80s, it was Spider-Man, to some extent, going after criminals. He would see them committing a crime, and he would stop them, and then tie them up in webbing, and attach them to a lamppost so they'd be swinging there so that the cops would come along and punish them for what they had done. And again, this is very much against the idea of progressivism. Why? Because in progressive ideology, a criminal doesn't need to take responsibility for his crime or for his actions. Why? Because it wasn't his fault. Why? Because it was the social pressures that actually made him become a criminal. So it's that society has failed the criminal, not the criminal that failed society. Therefore, to make him pay, to say personally, you as an individual, you have to pay for your crimes and take responsibility for them, that's an idea that is completely contrary to the progressive ideology. Thirdly, we look at the fact that, as is usually brought up, Spider-Man is born out of the idea of with great power comes great responsibility. But again, this is a product of an individual choice that is an individual realization on the part of Peter Parker. And he must, in his estimation, personally use that power in order to stop injustice. And that points right back to my last point, which he's making individuals pay for their crimes. Now, you'll notice what he doesn't do, because within some other comic book origin stories, you get a tragic event happening, and then the so-called hero shakes his hands at the heavens and curses the world for being unjust, and therefore he's going to take vengeance upon the world by so-called bringing justice to those around him. That's not heroic. That's the progressive ideology at play. That's saying, no, it wasn't them as an individual, nor is it me as an individual. It's the world. It's the system. It's the man. That's where all of the evil comes from. But Peter Parker does not do that. Peter Parker feels guilty for not having stopped that criminal when he had the chance to do that individual thing, that individual choice that he made. And that guilt, again, once again, being a product of the old way of looking at justice and society, that blossoms into another act of the will, which is a realization that he as an individual must act, and he will make these other individuals not pay through vengeance or anything of the like, but be brought to justice. And then we have the earmarks of all of that playing forward into the rest of the storylines, whereas you have him making this act of the will, again, which is an individual thing, going back to that individual idea of justice, that old definition of rendering to everyone what is their due. Every one, not every group, every one. He pursues justice in this way, and he does it. He makes that choice over and over again. He puts that mask on over and over again, and this becomes a habit of serving justice, which is the exact way that you build a hero within the traditional system. The traditional Western civilization way of being a hero is being a paragon of virtue. Those virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and they are all preceded by right reason. Peter Parker finally realizes what he has done and what he must do within the tragedy of his story. He makes a decision which is akin to that realization of what really he should have done, which is an example of prudence, and then he pursues the next virtue in line, which is justice. And he does so over and over again, because how do you pursue virtues? Well, through habit. You make it a habit that you become just, or temperate, or prudent. And this is exactly what he does. And this is what we see within the storylines, because it is not easy for him to be Spider-Man. He wants to quit over and over again, but he doesn't allow himself. This is not something terribly that he wants to do, but he has to do. And in making that decision over and over again, he builds up those virtues, and he becomes heroic in his pursuit of justice. And the other telltale of this is the person who is, next to Peter Parker, probably the most reoccurring character within all of the older stories, which would be J. Jonah Jameson. Because what does JJJ do? Well, he tries to use the system that he has control of, which is the newspaper, to do what? To villainize Spider-Man in a social way, which is part of a shaming system. And Spider-Man handles this in two ways, which shows that he's unaffected by this shame system. Number one, he doesn't care what they're going to print about him. He even contributes by providing photographs for them to shame him publicly. He doesn't care. Now, it affects him a little bit, but really, he doesn't care. And partly why he doesn't care is because, once again, you go back to that individual. What he does in order to prove this entire thing wrong is that he, as an individual, affects the lives of other individuals by ensuring that they are treated in a just way. Again, stopping criminals from robbing them, killing them, etc., and making sure those criminals are then taken to the police. Again, this is in service of justice. This goes back to the individual rendering to everyone what is their due. And this, by the way, I would say is why they had to, over the last little while, make JJJ an ally of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. They couldn't keep up that original storyline of the system shaming Spider-Man. Why? because these quote-unquote progressive people see shame as the actual mechanism whereby you determine whether or not someone has done something wrong, whether or not they are a villain or a hero. In their minds, that's the standard by which things are calculated. And so if he's shamed over and over again, being said that he is not a hero in the progressive mindset, that would be true, and he would no longer be a hero in their minds. Therefore, they had to get rid of this entire part of the storyline and take JJJ and make him an ally. But after doing that, after showing you how, yes, indeed, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, is a traditional hero, he is not a progressive hero. No matter how many times these quote-unquote progressive people keep on stating that he is not. At the very least, in his origin and most of his stories. But there is a point wherein he stops, at the very least, being a traditional hero and starts his slide down towards becoming a progressive quote-unquote hero. And I'm sure many of you will not be surprised when I say that, yes, it is Joe Quesada and his One More Day that broke Spider-Man. Why? Well, I'll try to be objective about it. Go back to moral theology class and say, if you want to evaluate something morally, you find the objective standard in the entire situation and you use that as your true north. This is quite the opposite of the quote-unquote progressive way of looking at things and the way a lot of people look at things today, which is to say that it's situational ethics. It's all dependent upon where you are and what's going on and all these other factors, and all of those play into whether or not what you did was right or wrong. No, you find an objective standard and you match everything according to that objective standard, that most important objective standard within the situation, and you use it as the guide to understand what is right and wrong here. So that's what I'll do. I'll go back to the most objective standard within the choice made within One More Day. If you're not familiar with it, it's where Peter Parker is dealing with the fact that his Aunt May, who is his mother figure, is dying, and he decides to make a deal with the devil, which Mythos is literally Marvel's version of the devil. He makes a deal with the devil that he will give up his marriage to the devil so that his aunt can have one more day. Now, that one more day becomes a lot more than one more day, but it's still a deal with the devil so that he will get more time for his mother figure than in payment he will give up his wife and his marriage. This is a dishonorable, unjust, and entirely selfish choice on the part of Peter Parker. Why? Well, first of all, I have to point out that Aunt May is not his mother. She is his mother figure. So he doesn't owe the same amount of honor to her as he would to an actual mother. I know that might be a controversial take, but yeah, that's true. If you want to look at something like moral theology, yeah, that's a statement. That's you pay more honor to your mother than someone you see as your mother because you owe your mother honor. But even assuming that she was his actual mother, it's still an unjust thing to do. Why? Because although you have a natural duty to honor your mother and your father, you have both a natural duty and a sworn duty to honor your wife. You stand up before what usually is what you see as the highest authority that you can go to. In Peter Parker's case, yes, it was a justice of the peace, and you make a solemn vow that yes, you're going to love, honor, and cherish this woman for the rest of your life. That is a sworn duty. You are swearing an oath there to do so. And violating that oath is dishonorable, even if it's for your mother. If you want to be religious about it, go back to scriptures. Yes, this is why a man leaves his mother and his father and cleaves to his wife. It is now more of a duty incumbent upon him to honor his wife than his mother. But Peter Parker does the exact opposite. 1, he makes a deal with the devil. 2, he is protecting this woman who is his mother figure, not his mother. 3, he is serving her more than his actual wife. And so, what is the statement being made here? He does all of this because he needs it. It is his feelings at this point which are more important than justice. And as I always say, you can go right back to, at the very least, Plato in the 4th century BC, saying, yeah, this is known as the greatest of evil. when you value what is your own above what is true. The same statement was made growing out of the Hebrew system and into the Christian system. I think it was probably one of St. Paul's letters. If I remember correctly, it might be to Timothy, but don't quote me on that. He says almost the exact same thing. And I have to stick this in here just as an aside. Can you imagine being Joe Quesada's wife and having him deliberately put together this story where the hero, in his eyes, values his mother more than his wife? But yes, that is the death of Spider-Man right there, because he falls. And although heroes fall and get back up and reach towards that point over and over again if they're truly heroic, no, he falls. A switch was thrown in that instance, and he is no longer a hero. To describe it very quickly, according to the system of virtue and how you build a hero or become heroic, it is, as I always think of it, the fact that you have right reason and those four virtues in a circle. Right reason is first, then you have prudence, then you have justice, then you have fortitude, then you have temperance. But temperance is the linchpin. Why? Because temperance controls how you view yourself and other people. And if you view yourself and other people in an unjust way, that destroys the way that you yourself can see reality, which then destroys your ability to have right reason, which then knocks over prudence, which then knocks over justice, which then knocks over fortitude, which then knocks over the rest of temperance. So in essence, it destroys the entire system if you have a distorted view of yourself and other people around you that is not in accord with reality. Then yeah, it destroys the entire system of how to be a hero. And so for Peter Parker, slowly from that point onwards, he became a progressive icon. Not because they love his origin or anything else, but because he's a useful instrument. Because I've been talking this entire time about Peter Parker Spider-Man as being part of the American mythos. And I always pull out this quote, I think it's probably from 2012 if I remember correctly, with a person that was in control of character development and content went on an interview and said, yes, these characters in Marvel, they are the American mythos, but they need to be used in a psychological way to push ideas. And those ideas, she discusses within that interview and plenty of other times, are heavy progressivism. And the extension of that was being the director of characters and their development. She goes on to implement a system whereby you can't have a pathos, a moment of pain like Peter Parker did, and use that for the origin point of characters anymore. Again, going back to shunning that act of the will, that individual thing as the origin of these characters they want people to see as heroes, because that individual choice is contrary to the progressive ideology. Moreover, we have creators who are in charge of Spider-Man right now. People, of course, like Joe Quesada, who continue to live in that American mythos city of New York, but don't see or don't take account of the massive amounts of crime as it rises all around them. And we can see this in storylines. Just last year, there was a storyline, maybe it was earlier this year, about Tombstone, one of the older villains from the 90s of Spider-Man. And I stood there and read it at my comic shop because that guy doesn't really care. And the whole thing was about Tombstone, and it was an apology for why he was a criminal. Because as a child, he was tormented and beaten up by other children because he was an albino. Therefore, he was considered other. So he was oppressed in this way. And that's what led him to become a criminal. You see, it's not his choices. It's not the fact that he chose over and over again the vicious thing to do instead of the virtuous thing to do, which is where a villain comes from. He does the exact same thing as a hero. His habit, however, is tended towards vice instead of virtue. No, none of that comes into play. It's that he was oppressed and beaten up as a child because he was different. And of course, because that system did that to him, it made him into a criminal. Therefore, it's not his fault. And that's exactly what the writers and producers of Spider-Man are doing right now over and over again. They live in New York. They think it a beacon of diversity, but they ignore all of the massive amounts of crime which is continually rising about them. Why? Because that crime is not part of what the individuals have to take responsibility for. It's not their problem. Quite the opposite, and bizarrely, if you ask me, but if you go into the quote-unquote progressive mindset, they would say that this rise in crime would actually prove their point. Why? Because for them, again, you have to remember that crime is not a product of an individual's actions, and therefore they don't have to take responsibility for them. Crime is a product of bad systems. So they're saying, look at all this diversity around us with all these diverse amounts of people in our cities. And you see all this crime? Well, that just shows us that the system doesn't work, and these new people with their diversity are going to come in here and get rid of those systems which are oppressing them and making them become criminals. And they can't write a good Spider-Man story because this is all exactly contrary to the origins of Spider-Man, wherein that individual, Peter Parker, made a choice, spurred on by a realization that as an individual he must do something, and this leads him to take responsibility for the power that he possesses. These quote-unquote progressive people who control the creation of Spider-Man stories right now can't acknowledge that as actually being true, because if they did, then they would be wrong. And if they're wrong, and pointed out through objective facts that they are wrong, it would hurt their feelings. And of course, their feelings are much more important than truth and justice. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are links in the description and on the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 low fantasy. The superhero ones are around 80 pages each. The fantasy graphic novel, Crom the Destroyer, is 66 pages. They focus on traditional storytelling, traditional heroes, and do so through simple, entertaining action and fun. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and order one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.